Design is everywhere.
So are we.
Design Museum Boston is supported by members like you.
Unlock a world of design by becoming a member of Design Museum Boston.
Thanks for getting us all together here tonight. Thanks for coming, all of you, with all the snow outside. That's a great turnout, and we're very happy. And looking forward to hearing great things about data visualization from these three fantastic panelists today. It couldn't be a more timely topic to talk about, and we'll hear why and how come in a bit. Just to start us off, and before introducing the panelists, I'd like to give a brief quote by Donella Meadows. For those of you who don't know her, was one of the preeminent scholars in environmental science, systems science, and she said, "Words and sentences must, by necessity, come only one at a time in linear logical order. Systems happen all at once. Pictures work for this language better than words, because you can see all the parts of a picture at once." So in this context, we'll hear a lot of different insights from the world of data visualization in these three different domains that the panelists bring together. We've got here today Angela Bassa, data science manager at Enernoc, where she leads the newly formed data science team and works on the development of advanced learning algorithms and data quality processes. We've got Michael Ledoux, an associate creative director at Sapient. Michael has been in user interface development and user experience design for the past 30 years. His experience have included being a front-end developer, information architect, visual and interaction designer, and he has spent much time in data visualization for energy, financial, and business consulting institutions. Last but not least, Nigel Jacob, co-founder of the New Urban Mechanics at the City of Boston, a computer scientist by background, and he has been working on the cutting edge of civic innovation for the past several years. In particular, he's working to create a network of civic innovation laboratories that spans the globe and enables cities to collaborate around the development of new kinds of civic technologies. So given that wonderful mix of people from diverse backgrounds, perhaps we can start with Angela, whose all of the panelists have provided some slides of some data visualizations that are particularly meaningful for them, and we'll give each of you a chance to just talk us through them and then kick off the conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Angela. I am the manager of data science at Enernoc, as Christian mentioned. And I came into the world of data visualization via a very circuitous path. I essentially started studying mathematics and decided that I liked art more than numbers. And it's very nice that you started with that quote, because that quote leads me into this picture very nicely. So this is what's called a pianogram, and this is the Flight of the Bumblebee. So does anybody remember that song? Do you guys know what it is? So this is the distribution of all the different keys on a piano that get pressed during that particular song. So what this allows us to do in one way is to experience the entire song, which is, depending how quickly the bumblebee flies, can go between 4 minutes and 6 minutes. And so you can see the entire song right here. Now, this, to me, is a very special representation because it's just a deconstruction of music, and music is something that resonates so strongly with all of us. And this, to me, is a perfect example of what data visualization cannot be. This doesn't make me understand what the bee went through. This doesn't make me excited about the different circuitous path that the bee goes through, the same way that I came into data visualization. And this just tells you the facts. This doesn't tell you a story. So I love the visualization for its intellectual curiosity component, but to me, it's very important as a beacon of what not to do, which is to just simplify something, but not have an impact, not have a takeaway, not have a narrative, not have anything that we can take away other than just data. So that was the first data visualization that I wanted to share with you guys as sort of a cop-out, because it's easy to find what not to do. Here's one data visual that I think, to me, is also very resonant, because this shows to us that we live today in the safest time in history. When we think that violence is going up and we are all always terrified, the 24-hour news cycle has sort of indoctrinated that fear into our psyche. But the data is truth. The data is more important. That requires a level of respect. So as data continues to evolve in the early 21st century, what we're starting to find is that anyone can be a data scientist. Really. You open up RStudio, it's free, just download it, browse a little bit, you're gonna find a couple of packages, plug them in, plug your data through, and all of a sudden you have these amazing findings. Well, what happens is when you don't actually understand what it is that you're doing to that data, how you're transforming that data, how you're manipulating that data, how you're introducing biases to that data, then the interpretation of it becomes sort of flawed. And that's where the artistry comes in. That's why not everyone can just be a data scientist or a data visualizer, because we're not just telling pictures of the story. We're telling the story. We're telling the entire story. So here, the thing that's really interesting to me about this data is that in a two-dimensional field, we have a three-dimensional story. Now, as the panelists keep going, there are going to be more and more involved visuals, and I'm kind of really lucky that I'm the first one because mine were sort of more rudimentary foundational story building. But here you have a vertical component, you have a horizontal component, you have a spatial component, you have a color component. So you have all of these different visual stimuli that make you understand what it is that the person who created it was trying to impart on you. If we go back, and we don't have to, I'm pretty sure you guys have it in your mind, the pianogram, what did that tell you about the author of The Flight of the Bumblebee? What did that tell you about the emotion that that particular piece of music is supposed to evoke? Nothing. Here, you can see that as violence has progressed through the years and as we became much, much more efficient at inflicting pain, we've also become much less willing to do so. And I think this is a beautiful data visualization to translate that thought. So having said that, I'm going to pass the baton.
Thanks, Angela. Michael.
Yeah, so I'm Michael Ledoux, and my angle on data visualization is more of a kind of a pragmatic or best practices approach to creating data visualizations. Oftentimes you'll see data visualizations that are very compelling and they have a very strong visceral kind of effect on people. They're really incredible looking, but for a lot of people they might be very hard to interpret. So my angle, based on the type of work I do, where people need to use data visualizations to give them answers, actionable information, direction, show where the opportunities or misfortunes are, I need to make them to be interpretable. And so that's kind of my take. And what can I stand up, Joe, to roam a little? So I brought some data visualizations. Some of them I think are from the Wall Street Journal, which does a great job. But again, when you're creating good data visualizations, you really have to lean on a few different areas of things like good design principles, going back to things like human factors, biologically, how we see and interpret colors. We could also talk about cognitive abilities, how much you can remember from going from one part to another. And it should be on this side. Is that okay? Oh, okay. And so having said that, I like this approach because, sorry. Yeah, thanks. This is from Educational Opportunity Monitoring Project, where it shows test scores between white and black students in the public school systems throughout the United States. And I thought it was a nice way of rendering and make it understandable, where the large black circle is the average for that state against the national average, and the red circle is the black population, the white is the blue is the white population. And I think you can, because you can't interact with this static image, but if you could be clicking on the state of Massachusetts, it highlights Massachusetts, it brings all this kind of supporting information. So I think a good data visualization can can represent the data, give a high-level message, but it also allows the person to drill into some of the detail, but still keep this overall view. So when I talk about design principles, there's a few principles that I think are important. One principle I use is called common fate. Common fate means that when you click on something and everything else kind of moves in the same direction or at the same time, you build a strong relationship between those items. And this is a really good example of like common fate in use of a design. So if I click on, I clicked on, oh, excuse me, this is a visualization of U.S. bachelor's degrees by gender and ethnic diversity. So we click on engineering, and all of a sudden everything else kind of comes alive in this visualization. So all the genders and the ethnic groups kind of show up and show who's connected to this particular bachelor's degree in engineering. And the thickness of the lines dictates kind of their participation in that major. So there's a lot of things going on in design. We're talking about shapes, a different type of characteristics and attributes that bring attention. It could be shapes, it could be colors, it could be animation. So with that in mind, we also have to think about the type of metaphor, mental models we use for a data visualization. That's really important. Do you reach for a domain metaphor? Someone in the financial industry, you know, if they do an application about risk analysis, are you thinking a good metaphor would be a cliff, a steep cliff, and those particular companies are interested in buying or selling are on that cliff based on some risk factors. They change the risk factors, that cliff levels out. I don't think that would scale well to what they have to do. They might be better served by having a colored tree map that shows those individual investments a part of their industry, a part of their domain, so you can see a bigger picture and provides better insight to that particular holding within that industry. So let's go to the next slide. Sorry. This is one of my favorite data visualizations, also from the Wall Street Journal. This shows winners and losers, jobs and losses for different industry types. And again, you can't interact with this, so I'm going to be your interaction model here. There are a lot of things I like about this. First of all, I think someone could look at this, and after clicking on a couple things, they'll understand how to use it. So just to give you an idea, so this is a time frame. Each column is a month, going from 2005 to the current date today. And each circle represents a particular industry type, or job sector. So if I click on this dark red ball at the bottom, that's construction. As soon as I click on this is where that idea of common fate comes in. All the other construction balls appear, all those other black balls appear. So you can quickly see how construction is done before the big recession, during the recession, and afterwards. You could see, like during that recession period between 2008 or maybe even before that, all the black balls are below this kind of our threshold line here in the center. You can see everything is below. Visually, I can see that, all that information. I can see that particular thing I'm interested in. Good visualization, data visualization will allow that to happen with this huge amounts of data to isolate things, to bring to the surface something of interest, and also to support it with specific data around it. So a good example of common fate. The other thing is, this really, like, can my developer create something like this? I drew this up on a piece of paper, or I used Photoshop or Fireworks or Illustrator, one of the Adobe design tools to create this. Well, do the developers in their application charting applications, can they support this? I would say that first of all, don't be confined by using an application, by what charts they can deliver. Think outside the box. Use pencil, paper, or design tool, and then deal with the developers and their capabilities and see what they can. You challenge them a bit. This could really simply be a stacked bar chart that they're using for this particular display. And it just actually, instead of the bars, they're using circles. And so there's, definitely capabilities within a lot of the certain applications that we have. So don't be shy about conjuring up some really creative, interesting thing that you feel it's going to really communicate well the visualization. Any other slides or that? Oh,
That's
and that's it. So sorry.
Segue. Thanks, Michael. Segue for Nigel. Nigel actually made it snow tonight in order to better illustrate
Just for the purposes of our demo.
how this works. So powerful stuff.
Yes, we have a great deal of power. So my name is Nigel Jacob. I'm the co-chair of the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics. We're the city's R&D lab. And so essentially everything that we do in urban mechanics is about reinventing the interface between the public and local government. So these folks are experts in data visualization, and I am not. I approach data and data visualization from the perspective of our mission, which is about delivering service to the public. So when we think about the role that data visualization plays for us, it is typically around 3 dimensions. The first is we are always trying to build empathy and understanding across the city. The second is that we are always trying to build or to make complexity comprehensible. And the third is we are always trying to build trust. So these visualizations, I think, highlight those 3 elements in a few different ways. So this is an app that a colleague of ours spun up a couple weeks ago. It's called SnowStats. And you can guess immediately what it does. But its story is actually kind of interesting. In the last several years, say 2 to 3 to 4 or 5 years, there have been various attempts to make city operations more transparent. And so the knee-jerk reaction that a lot of cities had, and we did this to some degree, was to put trucks on maps, right? So that you as a resident could see where the plows were going around the city. But what we began to find was that only tells you a tiny sliver of what's going on. And we began to get people asking us about like what is happening everywhere? What is in aggregate happening across the city, in my neighborhood, and so on. So we saw this as an opportunity to tell a story. And it is telling the story here of how the city responds to snow and what is happening everywhere. So you put in your address, and it tells you a bunch of things that the city is doing in your neighborhood, across the city. You can see the names of your plow drivers, because we're trying to give you a sense, or to personalize the folks that are in those trucks. So it's not just government, it's Steve that is plowing your truck. And so we got a lot of feedback from the public about, wow, Steve seems to have been on his truck for a long time. Maybe you guys should give Steve a break. We were Steve was making a lot of money. He's doing what he wants to do. But again, this is a way of making what might be a complex system, namely how cities respond to big severe weather events, more comprehensible. It's a way of I think, by making it reasonably attractive, building trust. What we found is that by building tools that people want to use and that are a little bit delightful to use and are fun to use, it actually does result in people trusting us a little bit more, or trusting at the very least that we are doing our best to deliver services that are interesting to you. Next. So this is a different kind of visualization. This is an interpretation of a complex system. So if you're, up until relatively recently, a couple of years ago, if you're a parent of a Boston Public School child, and you had to enroll your child in school, you had to read through a very complicated pamphlet that was, I should have shown you what it looked like, but it was incredibly dense because the system is complex. The Boston has a very kind of complicated history around making its schools or giving children and parents as many school options as they can. And through the 70s, we began to develop a busing system. And what has resulted in here we are in the 21st century, a system in which any kid can go within bounds to any school that they want to. But that means that your options are incredibly complicated. And so trying to read through what your options were was a very daunting task. And we used to get feedback from parents that would say, having to read through that awful pamphlet keeps me from, or I procrastinate when I try to register my kids for school. And that has major implications because if a parent does not register their child on time for school, they have fewer schooling options. So that has major equity implications. So the idea was, let's just make that a little bit friendlier to use. So this is a platform that we developed a few years ago with an organization called Code for America. And it makes, it makes the system a little bit easier to use, right? It's basically, TripAdvisor for schools, or like hotels.com for schools, where you as a parent, you can explore your schooling options, and it's designed around essentially like an exploration metaphor, right? So you can put in a few characteristics, where you live, do you have another child in school, in a public school already, and you get to dive into it. And this platform, I think, has begun to reset the way, based on what the public and what parents are telling us, this has begun to reset the way parents think about the quality of services that Boston Public Schools and Boston City Hall delivers. And so this has really been a game changer for us. You go to the next one? So this is a related platform. So why don't you press play, and then people can see it, and then I'll talk through it. So as I was mentioning, Boston has a very kind of complicated schooling system. So I'll let you watch this for 1 sec. So essentially what we're going to see is the journey of the children in one particular neighborhood across the city as they go to school. This is the journey that kids have to go through. As you can see, the kids go to 64 different schools. In aggregate, they travel 1,700 miles when you count out sort of the amount of time spent on roads, and that's for 1,100 students. So that 1,700 miles, that is just about the distance from Boston to Denver. Right? So that's what's happening to the children in this neighborhood. This is an attempt to make a complex system comprehensible. It's an attempt to make the situation intuitive for people, because just talking about busing can be a very abstract concept. But here you get a sense as to what this is doing to a neighborhood in a sense. It's sending children everywhere. And it's sort of, it's sort of the current state of affairs in Boston. And I think it presents people with a intuitive starting point for understanding if we want to change the system, what kind of tweaks do we need to make that will make the system more equitable. So that's where I'll stop.
Great. Thanks, Nigel. I'm confused though now. There's this. I had this idea. Data was all about truth. There's the data. There's one truth about it, and now you talk about curating the data, telling stories, getting empathy of people. How does the source? Where does the data come from, and how do you work with that then? In a way to tell something about your stories. Where's the data from? How accurate is it? How do you convey this? Angela, how is that in your
Data's
your work?
A mess. Data's a mess always. And I think, at least for me, and I'm sure for our team at Enernoc, I think the hardest part of building a data visualization, that's a lie. The second hardest part of building a data visualization is understanding that data. And so it'll come from a myriad different places. It'll come from a myriad different directions, sources, units, dimensions. And the first step in the process is self-education of what the data actually means before you can tell the story that the data is telling. You have to learn the language that the data is speaking in. And I'm Brazilian. I was born and raised in Portuguese, but most of my data doesn't speak to me in Portuguese. I think the same thing is analogous to everybody in this room. The data doesn't speak to you in English. The data speak to you in Datees. And the first step is to find out wherever the lexicon is, wherever the syntax is, so that you can start writing sentences and writing paragraphs. And hopefully, at some point, you stop writing prose and you start writing poetry. And that's where the visualization comes in, where you tell an entire system story in a picture or in an interaction, as the other visuals have shown. So I think that's the second hardest part. And the most difficult part, I think, is the empathy. I think it's understanding that your user is not stupid. Your user may be time constrained. They may have the attention span of a gnat. They may be pressed for time, for resources, for money, but they're not dumb. The one thing they are not is dumb, because the moment you express contempt for your audience, is the moment that the story is completely irrelevant. Because you're no longer actually having a dialogue. At that point, you're just having a soliloquy. And who wants to be getting yelled at? But in terms of the data, in terms of the particulars of where the sourcing comes from, and who said this? Somebody in the audience must know, but somebody said 90% of building a data visualization is spent on understanding the data, and then the other 90% is spent on picturing the data. So it's very even keeled.
How does it look like in your case to get from the raw data, wherever that comes from, to something meaningful?
Well, just on the accuracy of the data, if I can just continue on that area. So I feel, and from what I've seen, it's sometimes a lot of innocent mistakes made in the design of data visualization, and that's scales could be off relative to the data that you're viewing. So, it might give a larger sense of change when it really isn't. I think Tufte, I think in his books shows a lot of things like that. So that's why I feel an area that I have a strong interest in is evaluation process for data visualizations. There's that common set of heuristics we use for evaluating websites and applications, but I think there's also a common set of heuristics for evaluating data visualizations to show that what you're looking at is valid as far as valid comparisons and valid degrees of change and creating the right message. So I think there's a great research article by this Swedish couple, and it's called, I got my paper here. Where is that? And what they did was now I can't find it. Where, there it is. It's called an heuristic set for evaluation and information visualization. And they examined 6 other studies of heuristics in evaluating data visualizations, and they came up with a superset of 10 out of these 6 sets of, I don't know, maybe a couple hundred of heuristics. So I think that's an important step to go through an evaluation process, a measured process, something that has proven heuristics to evaluate data visualizations. And it will encompass all sorts of things, from the things I mentioned about human factors, design principles, Gestalt, principles of perception, a whole array of items that you can really make sure that you got something that is complete, understandable, and correct and accurate.
And that uncertainty you talked about in the data that's there, do you ever convey that to the user ultimately? Do you try to get rid of that? Is it possible to get rid of that? Do you convey to the user?
I think for the evaluation, you just want to make sure that, like I was saying, all those comparisons and change is the sense of change, the degree of change is something that's going to be accurate and not make someone make a decision on something that is, they don't perceive as being a great change or a small change. So that's important. So I think, unless it's the tobacco industry or something, I don't think people intentionally want to mislead. But so
no next sponsor for the design museum.
Yeah, sorry.
We've canceled that.
Sorry, kill the sponsor there, but they're killing themselves.
Nigel, probably you've got the most complex set in terms of an entire city with all the things that are happening, not happening in a city. How do you deal with the data, where it comes from, to then make it useful?
So lots of data, obviously, in cities. What we know are typically, we know a lot about city operations, right? We know about how things get delivered and so on. The context around data for us has often, in recent years, been driven by the notion of open data, which is sort of an outgrowth of the focus on transparency. But when I look back over the last couple of years, I would argue that the need for data visualization demonstrates that transparency is not enough, right? We get pushed on all the time about being more transparent, about making more data open, which we are doing, as I think most cities and many governments are trying to do. The challenge is that just looking at that data, you have no idea what that means, right? This issue of trying to find the story in the data is really critical if we're going to be able to enable anyone to do anything intelligent with that, right? So we have found that whether it is giving, is just as important to give the social context in addition to a data set as it is to make sure that someone can access the data. Because you can't see necessarily the problem in the data then if you don't have someone telling you the history of busing in Boston or about the history of racial inequality in the city. Those sort of, that meta information is just as important as the actual data itself.
So you're talking about digging deep to understand where the data actually come from
Right.
in order to.
I mean, there has to be some, in other cases you might call it a data dictionary. That's a little bit too micro. In our case, it's really, there has to be an accompanying narrative, even if the narrative is wrong. Right, but it gives you a place to the narrative really becomes a hypothesis to think about the data, and then you can look at it to determine what is this actually telling us. Does this actually, does the insight that we get from these things, does it actually ring true when I look out the window? This is one of the really interesting opportunities that we have for using data in this way in the city, is that there's essentially ground truth outside. Right, so we can test it, so we can have a good sense as to when we're going off the rails. But that's been an important element in how we think about this. The idea of we have to attach some kind of a story to it.
But there's one thing on top of that too that I just want to highlight, which is it's really all about intent. So when you're talking about disclosing the uncertainty of the data, I think there's one really great example from Enernoc that predates my joining the company, and Jenny's actually here. She runs the team there that came up with this, which is there's this one service that we provide to customers. Every morning, they open their email and they see a message. And the message has one of two things. It's either green or it's either red. Green, you don't have to worry about it. Red, you probably want to stop using as much energy as you're using. Based on our predictions, our fancy special sauce, we think you're going to incur dollars tomorrow. And so we think you need to do something to not incur that fee. That's it. The data visualization of, and I can tell you, it is thousands upon thousands upon thousands of lines of code running on terabytes of data. But the output is either red or green. And that's it. And it's extremely easy to consume, but the empathy is, I'm sending it to somebody who doesn't want to have to worry about it. They want to know what they need to do. Do they need to do something, or can they sit on it? It's red, do something. It's green, sit on it, it's fine. And that the intent is the intent to help, and the trust comes from the fact that you see it over and over and over, and that builds that heuristic in the end user over time. This is for a user that is very specialized, and we had a particular intent in doing that particular visualization of our data. Some other users who have a different decision paradigm, they need a different a foundation to base their decision making on. For that user, perhaps you do want to show a band of uncertainty, or you do want to clarify that, you know what, the GSM model says we're going to get 24 inches of snow, but the NAM model says we're only going to get 8 inches of snow, and right now we don't know which model to trust. That's something that the Weather Channel didn't tell anybody before the first blizzard of 2015, right? That if your user just wants to know whether or not to send their kid to school when it's going to be 9 feet of snow, you just want to send them a green or a red. But if you want to tell them whether or not they are going to be making this complex decision, if they are a sophisticated consumer of that data visualization, then you know what? You can add dimensions and layers and interactions and components to it.
So, I was just going to say to Angela's very good point is, the preparations that you have to make before creating a good data visualization. And it just goes back to like good user-centered design approach for all the UX people out there. Doing the research, doing contextual inquiries, sitting with the users, understanding how they're using data, what their objectives are, what they need to do with the data, and then that's just going to help inform things later. So to go through that process, there is a process in place where, a logical process to gather this information to help inform the design.
So now we've got all this different data that comes from different places, and Nigel is suggesting to have a sort of vocabulary or metadata attached to the data that describes the context where it was generated. Now we've got the users as well, and they're all different, I guess. So how do you design for them? Not one data visualization for all users. this sort of hasn't been talked about much. It's been talked about a lot in product design, other domains of design. Data visualization, there's this one visualization. How does the user come in? How do you speak to your audiences? How do you get to know them?
So I was going to say, I think very much to Angela's point, I think intent and context is everything, right? Data visualization can't be everything to all people. We have to be focused on a particular group of people and a particular idea that we're trying to convey to them. We're in the fortunate position in that all of our data visualizations and the way that we think about this stuff is tied very much to the city and to what physical things that people have to do or decisions that they have to make. And so we have to be very specific in terms of, obviously, like, anyone can look at these things, but we design them with people that are trying to get specific things done in mind. And so that's a critical part of determining how we think about the colors and how we think about the UI and so on.
Also, the intent of the design too. I was talking about that Donald Norman's book, Emotional Design, where maybe the intent is to sell someone over to your company, and by creating a very compelling, very abstract data visualization, they might not understand it, but at a glance, they said, wow, this company really knows how to do things. This is a great kind of like sales tool, but if they had to use it, it would be a failure. So it depends on the intent of data visualization. So you get to that point, you get to a point where it's a visceral effect. To me, it's becoming more of an art form, than a really true helpful kind of data visualization. So the intent and the use is important. And so going back to user-centered design, knowing the user, what they need to do and how they interpret it, building using the right metaphors and the right mental models for them to be comfortable and quickly understand stuff. Because going back to human factors, we talk about there's a thing called pre-attentive unconscious part of your mind where you will interpret something instantly without thinking about it. And that has to be built into the design of these data visualizations.
You've talked about mental models. That makes me think of our wonderful international panel here, but also that all of you work for a very international audience. Part of you working on projects in different countries, Nigel having the whole world in a city, basically. People from different cultures where people read from left to right, from right to left, from vertical, other ways, other notions that are very different. Does that factor in at all in the way you use data visualizations and how?
Absolutely, because intent is everything, context is everything, and you don't have context without understanding who your user is. And if your user doesn't speak your language, doesn't write left to right, as you mentioned, doesn't read from this cover of the book to that cover of the book. So if you, in a very North Hemisphere, Western society, if you want to highlight something in your visualization, put it on the top right. Right? Cognitively, that's the first place we go. You want to make it really catchy? Make it colorful. Color is the #1 thing that neurologically we process before we process anything else. Shape is the second. You process color, you process shape, and then you process the whole. But you parse it separately. And different users in different regions, in different industries, in different with different goals, process things differently. So I was born and raised in Brazil, as I sort of mentioned, and a lot of data visualizations that work in Brazil really well fail completely here. And I think one of the ways that we can see that working really well is in the movies. Movies are not a data visualization, but they are a narrative, and they are a visual expression of a storytelling, and they guide you through visual stimuli to feel a certain way. If you're doing your data visuals right, you're doing the exact same thing. And so if you want to resonate with as many people as possible, you're going to have to go through the lowest common denominator, which means the amount of sophistication that you can embed in any one visual gets smaller and smaller and smaller, because every time you want to address a bigger audience, you have to shave some complexity off the visual that you're putting together. It's just we don't have enough cognitive baggage to be able to carry the context of the visual, including each one of the different interactions, including color, position, vertical, horizontal, size, is it facing left, is it facing right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, at Internoc, we're just doing all sorts of different approaches into Australia, into New Zealand, into Korea, and all of a sudden, there are actions that we are hoping to engender in our customers. We want them to save money. We want them to save energy. We want them to hire us again. And what happens is they interpret data in a very different way than we interpret data. And so, I hate saying this, I'm so sorry. At the end of the day, I'm sorry. At the end of the day, what you want is to be successful in your goal. And if your goal is to cause a visceral reaction, you can even put wrong data there. Because if your goal was to make somebody feel compelled to act, you put something really wrong there, and then you flip the page and say, by the way, I was lying, that met the intent that you had.
It's going to act against you.
Right.
Yeah, Michael.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, so cultural dimensions, localization, things of this nature. In the 1970s, IBM hired this guy named Hofstede to do all sorts of research on IBM's 350,000 employees worldwide. It was a very intense study that's still being used as reference for localizing your applications. So, you know, in part of the cultural dimensions would be things, you know, the way Europeans are very multitasking oriented. They can do many things at the same time. So if you have data visualization, they might be very good at all this different interactions at the same time and information, competing information. Whereas North Americans, I'm Canadian and so is Nigel, and you know, we're more used to very linear execution of information. So that
We're naturally smarter.
Well, that's true, especially in the province of Quebec. But no, he's Ontario. But
I was going to talk about localization next.
Yeah,
we're there. No.
Yeah. But yeah, sorry.
Sure. So when we think about, you're absolutely right. So Boston has an incredibly diverse mix of ethnicities and cultures and languages, and so we have to learn how people process information. And we start with simple stuff. We start with language. You know, what kinds of words do people respond to best? So we've done a little bit of research with a group called the Boston Area Research Initiative, in which we're looking at what kinds, if we are trying to, in general, one of the things we do in New York is try to encourage more people to become civically engaged, to become civically active. So we want to know what kinds of things, what kind of words can we say to you as a resident to encourage you to care about your community, about your neighborhood. And so we've done some experiments in which we'll do flyers with different language to see how people respond to them given the context. And so what we found, quite simply, if we put in words, if we have language that says something like, you know, help out the city or you know, help keep Boston cleaner versus help keep Fields Corner cleaner, nobody responds to the first message. Right? Because nobody thinks of themselves in terms of Boston. They think about what their neighborhood is. You know, Fields Corner. They're very hyper-local in that way. So we're very tribal in that way.
And
right?
was that across all of Boston?
So we did. So I don't want to say across Boston because in the three neighborhoods that we tested, it held true. And these were neighborhoods that had a very diverse mix of sort of languages and so on. And so that was really important for us. So when we think about how do we put information in front of people, we need to know that, which means that learning about how people consume information is critical to the success of any kind of data visualization or any information that we put out into the world.
You're ultimately talking about behavior change. That's what you want to obtain. Yep. And so we've got the visualizations, but then you guys want to achieve something. You want to send red or green and have people do something different after that. So how do you go after that? Do you measure that somehow? Do you consider that? Do you understand? Have you understood some best or better practices in how to achieve behavior change with the visualization, visual representation of data? Some things that didn't work also, some examples perhaps that you thought didn't work or something that worked very well. Any of you?
I can tell you in our case, things that do work well. What does work well is when you give, in our case, because we are very specifically looking at behavior change, giving people a very specific next step. Right? We can't simply say, I mean, you guys, some of you may remember in the 80s, you can't simply say, this is your brain on drugs, right? You know, you you have to follow the data up or the infographic or whatever it is with a specific behavior that you want them to do. Otherwise, it never happens. And so we see that in, certainly we develop different kinds of technologies, and what we find is when the next, when we follow up the message with, a task for them to do, we find a very different kind of follow through, as if we just said, register your kids for school on time, right? You have to give them something, there has to be something at the end of that sentence. Like, that can't be it. So that's been like a key for us. And I would say that before we had that insight, we tended to fail in how we communicated with the public.
That's really interesting, especially because you sort of open up the tool set available to working with data visualizations. And I want to talk a bit about tools and talking about the actual visuals, creating the visuals. Some of the audience here perhaps is working a lot around data visualizations. Some others are starting out. These days, we celebrate 25 years of Photoshop. Many of you probably have spent hours and hours with Photoshop, 25 years, something to celebrate. Now it's all the code, and we've got a code. Do graphics, software packages still have a life? In times of digital data visualizations, does pencil and pen and paper still have value? What are the tools that you sort of, people now walking away from this thinking, I want to start looking into this more. What would you tell people? What are tools to get started in working with data in this way?
Yeah, I think if you're really interested in doing data visualization, look at a lot of data visualizations. Look at the common themes, and there are some common design themes amongst all of them, and they'll stick in your mind, like that pre-attentive area where you get in your particular work, you have a task to visualize some data, and one of those will pop up in your memory. So again, it's also considering design principles and human factors in this, but also I still feel, I mentioned before, don't be confined by what a particular charting application can do. Use paper and pencil, think about mental models, metaphors, draw them out, be creative. And we can dial that back as we create those designs that you're thinking about, and maybe reinterpret them in a way that is accessible to the developers to help you create those. But I would say, just start, looking at a lot of, data visualizations. I think that'll be very helpful to see those common themes and how you would think about presenting that some data for yourself.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, I would just say that intent supersedes the tool. So if your intent is to start a dialogue, if you have a data visualization that looks undone, that looks ready for iteration, that might serve your intent better. If your intent is to get feedback and to mull over something, then if you come to the table with something that looks ready, looks like it's got a cherry on top of it, then that's much less likely to incite somebody to feel comfortable enough that they can comment on it, because they're going to go, oh, there's pride of ownership here. I don't want to tell you that you did something wrong because it looks so finished. So if the goal isn't the same goal as the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and the resources don't match those resources either, then there's nothing wrong with paper and pencil. There's nothing wrong with Excel, loathe Microsoft. But guess what? 90% of the visuals that I build are on PowerPoint. I'm a manager. How many managers here? Yeah. So it doesn't matter the tool so much as what it is that you're trying to accomplish. Tableau is a fantastic tool if you have structured data. If you want to plug it into a Hadoop cluster, you're going to make yourself cry to sleep. If you're going to be building something that is interactive, not doing it on R or on a dedicated interactivity-ready tool, you're going to cry yourself to sleep again. But it really is about what the goal is. And if the goal is dialogue, then looking unfinished may not be detrimental.
Now, there's a lot of dialogue in your work, Nigel. What does the process look like in your case?
Sure.
To go from sketches to...
Yeah, the full range. Our philosophy is really by any means necessary, right? Whatever it takes to get the point across, to get the story across. And we have a very broad palette of ways of doing that. Certainly we do a bunch of technology things, But another way of thinking about visualizing data or visualizing complexity can be film, right? So our resident documentarian is sitting right there, Chris Carter. Chris Carter, in addition to being a planner and engineer, is also a documentarian. And he does these incredible visualizations, I would say, these mini documentaries, but they really are visualizations about complex elements in which the city works. You know, maybe how we respond to the snow in this case, or the way that maybe the trash system works, whatever it is. But I think like that, when we are trying to communicate something, I think we have to look past the tools to the people that we're trying to communicate with. And in this case, we are trying to communicate, part of our intent, as I said, we're trying to personalize government and sort of demonstrate that we are an organization of people helping people. So the more that we can show people's faces and what they do as by way of a visualization, that's a really powerful tool for us. And so for us, everything is about the context and who we're trying to communicate with.
Yeah, I think data visualization is an art form. You know, I think there's it's very romantic. You know, it's very philosophical. It's something that I really admire those folks that do it well. I think they have a combination of skills where they're probably a visual designer / data, kind of have this kind of data visualization type of person combined. You know, they see things in a certain way. It's a very valuable.
Well, we're just making it.
Yeah, and it's I feel in the realm of careers too for user experience. We have like interaction designers, information architects. It's becoming its own kind of role in that field. But it's a very artistic field, and it might and Nigel is saying film. I mean, maybe data visualization might not be software related. It could be other things. Look at the monks, Tibetan monks. They build these beautiful sand structures, designs, and it could be anything that you could use. It might be something completely different than what we normally think of. But of course, coming back to the practical world, but I still feel it's a great skill. It's a great area for folks.
I think having arrived at the Buddhist mandalas is a great way to conclude that. Before we open it up for questions, because I know that Design Museum Boston crowd is known for the many critical questions that it's posing its panelists. A big round of applause for our panelists. Thanks a lot.